Good morning, everyone. I think we're getting started. I am Andy Smerick. I'm a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, working on education and some related domestic policy issues. I'm totally excited that we get to be here today to talk about charter schools and charter school composition issues. As all of you know, charter schools, school choice, this is huge at the state and local level. But today of all days, just a couple hours from now, the Secretary of Education designate, who is a big charter school advocate, big school choice advocate, Trump administration, big advocates of this. There's a heated debate, and there's going to be a confirmation vote that's really close, just at noon today. So this just goes to show that these issues that we're going to be talking about today, choice charters and school composition, this is in the heart of education policy and education politics at the federal level, at the local level, the state level. And this piece about who gets to go to charter schools, who's attending them, how this implicates equity and choice and preferences. This is all really important, and it's kind of one of the core issues now in K-12 policy. So we're very, very fortunate that we just don't get to bloviate on this, that we have brand new research from a terrific colleague, terrific scholar, Nat Malkus, who's going to present to us not one, not just two, but 3 different research papers on this subject. After he presents 25 minutes, I'm going to come back up here with our esteemed guests, Gail Burnett from Atlanta Public Schools, Andre Perry from the Hechinger Report, and Nina Reese from the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And so each of them will respond in turn to what they've heard, what they've read in the reports, and Nat's presentation. And then I'll pepper them with really hard questions for a little while. And then we will open it up to all of you guys in Q&A toward the end. We just have 2 rules on Q&A here at AEI. One is please introduce yourself, both name and affiliation. And number 2, take the Q part of Q&A seriously. That is, ask a question. Don't just give us a speech. We try to pride ourselves on having a discussion, not just a bunch of soliloquies going. So if I don't see a question mark in your future, I may have to pull the mic from you. But please do your best. Okay, as far as housekeeping, we are using a hashtag for this, for you social media folks. It's going to be hashtag measuring charters. So please chime in with your questions, comments, thoughts. I'm going to be monitoring this during the event. Hopefully I can integrate some of your thoughts toward the end. The event is being live streamed, so welcome to all of our folks watching in your pajamas or in your offices. We're also going to be posting this video directly after the event, so you can go back and annotate it if you'd like. Next week, we're having 2 more events here on education, one on private student loans and school finance. So if you like what you see here, you can go to our website, sign up, and learn more about the other 2. And last but not least, please silence or turn off your cell phones. Let's give Nat and his great research as much attention as we can. So on Nat himself, like I said, he's a terrific colleague here at AEI and a great scholar. He focuses on K-12 education and really brings a quantitative flair to this work. So it's not just qualitative work. He's using these big data sets to make us much more informed about school finance and school accountability and charters and choice and much, much more. And you're going to see that in the really groundbreaking research he's going to present today. Before coming to AEI, before we stole him away, he was at AIR. He was a researcher there. And unlike a lot of us in this field, he spent time in the trenches. He was a classroom teacher in the great state of Maryland in Prince George's County teaching middle school math. And most important of all, he is a Terp. He is a University of Maryland product, like yours truly, and like one of our guests. I'm going to talk more about that later. Go Terps. So let's do this. No more of my talking. Here's order of operations. I disappear. Nat will come up here for about 20 or 25 minutes and give his presentation. Then the 4 of us will come back up here. They will give their reactions. I'll ask questions, and then we'll save as much time as possible for all of you to get involved, including our friends at home who want to send in questions. And then my promise is to get everyone out of here by 10:30 a.m. so you can go about your day. Sound good? Great. Thanks so much for being with us, and please join me in welcoming our scholar, Nat Malkus.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for coming to hear 3 papers in one go. I've never done this before, so I will spend a little time on sort of the methods that I developed in the main paper, and then the other 2 papers are sort of variations on a theme. So I approached this research initially because I was interested in the national conversation around charter schools. Charter schools are now, there's, I think, 6,900 of them. They make about 1 in every 14 public schools since in the past 25 years. So they've grown into a huge presence. And there's also been sort of a huge conversation or debate often about them. And that debate generally centers on 2 sort of conflicting narratives. One of these narratives is sort of driven by a lot of charter advocates, and this is not all advocates, these are sort of caricatures on the end, but it often paints charter schools as sort of mission-driven organizations that are designed to serve disadvantaged students. And they provide innovations for these students, options for them that are alternatives to failing public schools. And so that's the sort of caricature on one side. And on the other side, there are critics who say, no, charter schools are cream skimmers, and they go into these different communities and they have these different means to get the best kids in the public schools to come there. And they do this because they're driven to profit by educating students that are less expensive to educate, and through some sort of hard means, punishments and so forth, they often get rid of the less advantaged students that they don't want to teach. Really, there's a different sort of model that sort of fits somewhere in between these 2, suggesting that charter schools, which are independently run but publicly financed public schools where all students are allowed to go, they're given freedom to develop innovative models, specific approaches to schooling, and that these may appeal to some parents and not others. Parents are given free choice, and so the upshot would be that we would better match parents' preferences, and so this is a good way to inject competition and choice into public schools. And but these arguments, these 2 narratives, really hinge on the kind of students that charters serve. Now, there's some rules that we have, generally speaking, for charters. They are public schools that are open to all students. And when there are more students that want to attend them than they have slots, students are admitted by random lottery. And when this works, we would expect that the students attending a charter school should be representative of all the applicants to the lottery. It's important to recognize that that's different from they should look similar to the other public schools around them. And again, some of the critics of charters will say, yeah, there's some workarounds there that charters can use. They could counsel kids out that they don't want to continue to educate. They could implement either sort of legal or not legal admission requirements. They can locate in specific areas, or they can use operations like discipline and demanding school climates to, again, sort of counsel out folks. But the question is, at what, which of these 2 narratives sort of is at play across the board in charters? And I sort of am a data analyst at heart, and so I wanted to look into the data. But there's a problem here with the data, too. There has been 2 sorts of approaches to comparing charters and traditional public schools. And the question is, well, which traditional public schools should we compare charters to? So here's a map that sort of illustrates the difference. This is a little dated by now, but these are the data that I have, the states that had charter school laws, and the red dots are traditional public schools, and the blue dots are charters. And immediately you can see that charters are sort of clustered in some areas, and that there's a lot of traditional public schools that sort of cover the rest of the country that probably shouldn't be compared to charters because students don't have a choice between them. So the question is, if we're going to compare the nature of charter students to those in traditional public schools, which of these red dots should we compare to the blue ones? there's a lot of studies that will compare both. And I'm going to show you in a second why that's sort of a bad approach. There are other studies that are sort of in these pockets that make careful comparisons between charters and traditional public schools, but these usually don't generalize to the rest of the country. A study of Massachusetts charters doesn't tell us about the nature of all charter students. So I wanted to find a way to match each charter school to a set of comparable traditional public schools. And the approach I took was fairly simple. I matched each charter to the nearest 5 traditional public schools that served the same grade range of children that were located in the same jurisdiction. So the idea being that the closest schools to the charters should look like them unless there's some particular academic model or some approach that appeals differently to the students in the charters than in the traditional public schools. And I was able to apply this nationally because the nearest 5 schools works as sort of a comparison method, similarly in New York City, which is very dense, as it would in Arizona, which would be less so. So to illustrate this, I compared charters to all traditional public schools, which again, I don't think is a great idea, and just to their neighbors. And so to illustrate this quickly, here's comparisons by locale. And you see that all traditional public schools are here in the blue, and charters are in the orange. And it's quite obvious, and none of this should be surprising, that charters are much more often located in urban areas. Their neighboring schools, and of course this makes sense because they're matched to charters based on location, are not. But what this tells us is that locale is not necessarily an aspect of charter schools as much as it is where they're located. School size might be different. There are some reasons we might expect charters to be smaller. They're younger schools. Some have enrollment limits. And indeed, this is what we see, right? You see that traditional public schools, all of them in blue, and just the neighbors of charters in gray, tend to be larger, and charters sort of tend to be smaller, having less than 200 students. So again, here we're just saying that school size is sort of an attribute of charters. But this is not what we're here for. We're here for student characteristics. So let's look at student poverty as measured by percentage of free and reduced price lunch. We often think of charters as serving more poor students than traditional public schools. And again, when you look at the orange bars, especially out here in the high poverty schools with more than 75% of poverty, we see that yes, charters do tend to have higher poverty rates, but not compared to their neighboring public schools. I would suggest that this is evidence that charters don't necessarily serve poorer students as much as they're located in areas with more poor students. Special education is a different sort of thing. Again, we see a different pattern here where charter schools, many more of them have lower special education rates than both traditional public schools and the neighboring, traditional public schools that neighbor charters. And again, there may be a variety of reasons for this, but it would suggest that special education and lower rates of special education enrollments is a feature of charters, or at least associated with charters. And then the last thing I'll just show you is that suspension rates, again, this sort of twists the other way, where if you compare charters to all traditional public schools, it looks like there's a slight difference where they have higher suspension rates. But if you compare them to their neighbors, they're actually quite similar. So I looked at these, and this gives us some answer of compared to what charter school or what traditional public schools should we compare them. But you know, it flies in the face of what we might expect from charters, right? Charters are supposed to be different. They are supposed to have different and innovative models. So we might not expect them to be quite so similar to their neighboring traditional public schools. We might expect to see more differences in their student selectivity. So I thought, well, it may be that these average similarities are actually the product of about a good chunk of charters being more to one end in a kind of student, like more poor students, and another group being less. So I looked at the distribution of differences. So you not only have to care about who you compare them to, but how you compare them. So this chart takes a little explaining, and so I'm going to spend a minute on it because you're going to see a lot of different kinds of this chart the rest of the presentation. So I looked at the distribution of differences between each charter school and that charters neighboring 5 traditional schools. So I took the average poverty rate in the 5 traditional public schools and compared it to the charter. And if charters were similar, plus or minus 5%, they went in this gray category. And only about 16% of charters are actually close to their neighboring traditional public schools. In the dark red, you have the charter schools that serve a lot less poor students by 20 percentage points or more. And what we find over here is that almost a quarter serve a lot lower, have much lower rates of poverty. However, there's a balance here, right? If you look on the dark blue, you see that about as many charters serve more poor students, again, by 20 points or more. And so we see that there's a much larger spread. And the differences that looked very similar in terms of free and reduced price lunch in the early averages that I looked at are actually the product of charters being different and very different a lot of the time. Now, one question that you might ask is, well, what about traditional public schools? What if we just take charters out of the equation? How much variation would we see just in regular traditional public schools? So I crunched those numbers, and there are no charters at all involved in this bottom line. These reference TPSs are just sort of a benchmark. And we find that, hey, actually there's quite a bit of variety there too, but charters are pronounced in the dark blue and dark red categories, showing much more variation. So I did this for a number of other variables, and again, this is on national numbers. And these show actually some balance in some categories and not so much in others. For black students, a higher percentage of charters are represented in blue, serving more black students. The reverse is there for Hispanic students. So this suggests that, again, compared to the schools not across the nation, but nearby, a higher percentage of charters serve fewer Hispanic students. For both special education and limited English proficient students, or LEP students, charters tend to serve fewer than their neighbors. There's some balance on both sides. This is really sort of marked more than anything in my mind for LEP students. And just as a feather in my cap, when you compare the averages of all traditional public schools and charters on LEP students, their averages look the same. And so when you compare with those numbers, you think, oh, charters do a good job with LEP students. But they don't, because charters are in urban areas with higher percentages of LEP students. So only if you look at how they compare to their neighbors does it become apparent that a lot of them really serve fewer LEP students. In terms of proficiency, it leans higher, and in terms of suspension rates, and I think this is important because often charters are criticized for their high suspension rates, you actually see that a higher percentage of charters suspend students at lower rates than their neighbors. So what are the takeaways from these national numbers? Is there some evidence of student selectivity with charters? And I would say, yeah, there is. Which narrative does it support? Well, both and neither. It certainly doesn't say that there's one uniform characterization of charters, that they serve more disadvantaged students or less disadvantaged students. It's far more complicated than that. And of course, I think that the context matters. It doesn't matter just which schools or who you compare them to, but also how. Now, I wasn't quite satisfied with this, and I wanted to look at different ways that we might explain some of these variations. Could it be that it's differences by states, that there are some states that have much less or more advantaged sort of charter sectors? And then I also have an opportunity with my co-author, Jen Hatfield, to look at academic models. So I'm going to go through these quickly just to illustrate the different findings that we found when we looked more carefully. So these are the states that I had available at, in our data. We only used states that had 50 schools or more because I didn't want just for robust reporting. And today I'm just going to focus on 2 states, Oregon and Pennsylvania. They are just illustrative of the variation. So these are, a lot of numbers, but we'll just focus on some of them. It looks like Oregon charters, they serve a slightly higher percentage of black students, but the real differences come for Hispanic students and white students. a much higher percentage, a really high percentage. This is 2 in 3 Oregon charters serve fewer Hispanic students than their neighbors, and 2 in 3 serve higher proportions of white students. More than half of Oregon charters serve 20 percentage points fewer poor students than their neighboring traditional public schools. Those are pretty remarkable numbers. Again, for special education, particularly for LEP, we see imbalances. The student proficiency and suspension rates show variation, again, that are not particularly flattering. Now, I picked Oregon as an example of one of the states that really shows sort of a uniform distribution. And it is not complementary. And there's one other state, I would say North Carolina, that has some particularly troubling distributions as well. Overall, that's not the case. Most of the states that we see, especially the big states that have sort of longer history with charters, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. Look different. So Pennsylvania is a different example. It's a little bit more middle of the pack. We see that in Pennsylvania, charters tend to serve more black students. They have relatively balanced Hispanic enrollments, fewer white students, and more poverty. This is a little bit more what we'd expect in the sort of advocacy narrative that came out at the beginning. You see balanced special education and LEP enrollments. Proficiency leans positive for charters, and suspension rates lean lower. I would say, again, that while there are a lot of differences across states, and there's a lot of numbers to look up in Unlike Their Neighbors, which is available on the web at AEI, the pattern isn't totally clear. So just as an illustration, these are suspension rates by states, and you can see, while these are sorted by the lower numbers, the upper numbers do not tell some uniform story. It looks, again, like charters suspend a little bit less on average than their neighbors. But for every state like Missouri you have at the top, you have a state like New York or New Jersey that has much higher suspension rates. I think these are interesting largely because states have control over their charter sectors, and state authorizers are important here. But it doesn't explain the variation as much as I was hoping it was. So some of the takeaways: do state charter sectors differ? They do. Are they uniformly serving more advantaged or disadvantaged students? Not really. On the edges you find some, particularly Oregon again, but that's not representative of the whole. And I think that there's a whole conversation to be had here about authorizing and how it matters. And if you had more caffeine, I would start into that conversation right now, but I'm going to skip on to the other findings. One of the questions is about how, and I think that that has to do with what kind of academic models authorizers tend to bring into their states. So in this next paper, which actually is available today from AEI, and I think we have some copies out here, my co-author, Jen Hatfield, and I used a coding scheme to identify charters with specialized academic models. So how did we do this? We did this, and we also appreciate the data from the Alliance, which completed this. General charter schools are those, when we looked on the websites, we didn't find any indicator of these models that you see below here. So we just called those general, and we really couldn't look at them. If any of these other models were represented in our coding scheme, for instance, if a school said, we are a no excuses charter school, then we would put them in the no excuses. If they said, we focus on science, technology, engineering, and math, we'd put them in the STEM bucket and so forth. And so we wanted to see if these models were reflected in the demographics of students in the student composition. So I'm going to look here quickly and just show you what we found for specialized model. This is mainly as a guide for the others. And then I'm going to look at 3 of our specific academic models, which show some differences in student composition. A lot of numbers here, I know. I want to focus here on these neighboring TPSs because I think it's important both here and when you look at the report. In the far right, we see the composition of all public schools. And what we see is both for the neighboring traditional public schools for specialized charters and for general charters, they're fairly similar, and that both groups of charter schools are actually fairly similar to them. But these neighboring traditional public school demographics benchmark where charters are. So we see that the neighboring TPSs of specialized charters tend to be in poorer areas with more minority students and fewer white students. And then if you look all the way at the bottom, in areas where students score lower. Right? That is almost 40% of a standard deviation below average. So this is sort of the benchmark for where we find these different models. And then when we look at the distribution of differences, again, this is looking over a bunch of different models, 1,600 schools, and we see it's fairly balanced by poverty. We see that these schools tend to serve slightly more black and white students, fewer Hispanic students, and leans right on proficiency. We can talk about these. But these are sort of the benchmark to compare the different models for. And there we go. So here again, we see that same box. This is all neighboring specialized charter schools. And these are arts-centered charter schools. And we see that, at least according to their neighbors, these arts schools tend to be located in areas that have higher poverty rates, and they look fairly similar otherwise. They score a little bit lower. And then we can compare them to the percentages for arts charters. We see the poverty is a little bit lower. And if you look all the way down at student proficiency, we see a big jump there of over half a standard deviation higher. And we can look at the differences. And again, we see that there's some balance here, right? There's some balance on a number of things. For poverty, it looks like arts schools tend to serve fewer poor students, but really that doesn't capture the full spectrum, as there's about 28% that serve higher proportions. It leans that way. The percentage of arts schools that serve white students is much higher, proficient is much higher. LEP students, again, is quite low. If we look at international charter schools, again, looking at the neighboring TPS numbers, we see, again, a little higher poverty. Here we see a markedly higher Hispanic student population and LEP student population. And then if we look at the differences here, we see that international charters, and I should be a little clearer here because international may not be as clear a category, that's for dual language immersion programs, and any charters that are focused on sort of international educational themes. These schools tend to be slightly lower poverty, but the real difference is in their LEP numbers. This is where they really stand out from other charter schools. This may not be surprising given dual language as a organizing theme for international schools. And of course, their proficiency numbers lean far to the right here as well. No excuses charter schools are highly disciplined schools with high expectations for students. This is oftentimes what people first think of when they think of urban charter schools. And again, if we look at the demographics here, we see that there's the neighboring traditional public schools really differ here for no excuses. They are much poorer. They have much higher proportions of black students and fewer white students. No excuses charters compared to their neighbors have even more poor students and black students. One thing I'll alert you to is the differences in student proficiency. The neighboring traditional public schools are a full standard deviation below the average. That is a big difference. And if you look at no excuses charter schools that are located next to those, they are dramatically higher. That's 80% of a standard deviation is a huge difference in any research. And when you look at these differences, we really see a lot of uniformity for no excuses charters. Again, this is not compared to all traditional public schools. This is no excuses compared to the schools right near them. And the students in these no excuses schools are much more frequently poor, black, and much more proficient. I mean, the proficiency numbers are sort of astounding there. 7 and 10 are higher than their neighbors. One other thing to look at, a lot of times no excuses charters the hallmarks of them are their suspension rates and their tough discipline regimes. But actually what we find is compared to their neighbors, it's pretty balanced. There are some that suspend a lot more, but for each percentage there, you find some on the back end that are suspending less. So what are the takeaways from these academic models? The first thing that I would say is, are these real academic models? Have we actually captured what we set out to capture? And I would say yes, for two reasons. Number one, we find that they sort of hang together in the data. We identify them by these websites, and then we find that they are located in particular kinds of neighborhoods, and that and this is across cities and across locales, they tend to draw students differently from their public schools in similar ways. Are these differences by academic model consistent with the theory of action behind charters, that innovation will promote differentiated models and that those differentiated models may draw people differently? I would say that certainly circumstantially, this is evidence of that and of apparent preference matching. I'm going to try and get this to go forward. That's okay. The last question is, what should we make of these things? Are these distributions and these findings good or bad for charter schools, for the charter school movement, for public schools generally, and for the services that we give students? And the answer, I don't know the answer to that question. That's more complicated. Fortunately, we brought a great panel up here to answer those questions. So I think it's time for me to ask Andy to come back here and guide us through that discussion.
So as our guests are coming up here, please join us. There's so much in this data that is rich. Before our panelists get to weigh in, I got to ask, and you kind of teed it up at the end. I don't know how to reach a normative, judgmental conclusion about the basic finding here, which is, as I articulated it, if you have a bunch of different schools, and kids used to be assigned to schools based on their home address, and now there's a model where there's a wide array of schools doing a lot of different things, and low-income families in particular have more agency. Shouldn't we expect there to be variation? Some, a lot, a great amount? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I mean, the alternative is a thing that strikes me. If we didn't see such a variation, I would probably say, well, then why do we have a system of choice here? So do you have any thoughts on the extent of the variation, whether it makes you comfortable, uncomfortable, or another view could be, listen, when you let the floodgates open and empower families are going to make choices, and that's just one of the costs, the variation in what the demographics look like.
Yeah, I think this is very complicated in part because I worry about the assumptions we make about the things that we can measure and what they really reflect, right? So I would think that the preferences for different kinds of schools would not necessarily be that strongly linked to student poverty or to students' racial composition. So the fact that we actually see, and we don't see some clear uniform directions, but we see some changes, I think, are reflecting the loose linkages between the things that we can measure and the preferences that are operating in the market. As far as what should we make of these, I don't think that the general heuristic that we bring, or the general sort of categories we bring for what looks like equity in a classic public school assignment situation really works with charters. The question is, what kind of pattern of data would we look at and say, oh, well, this reflects equity in a charter system? Right. And I don't know how to evaluate that on the back end using numbers like these.
Great, and I think our panelists will have some thoughts on that. So let me kick it off to them, just brief introductions. You can find more of their biographical information online on our site if you'd like. But Gail Burnett is here from Atlanta Public Schools. She has this very important particular role that I think is so valuable in this discussion. She's a charter school authorizer, essentially. She is heading up an office within a big school system that is responsible for making decisions on whether or not a charter school can come aboard, and then monitoring it along the way. And some of these questions are embedded in the judgments you have to make. Not always. I think maybe 20 years ago we thought it was all about student performance, but equity and some of these indicators are at least meaningful. Next is Nina Reese, an old friend of mine, the head of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, president and CEO, also worked at the White House in the previous 2 administrations ago. Was the first head of OII, right? The Office of Innovation and Improvement at the U.S. Department of Education, which oversees the charter school office. And then Andre Perry from the Hechinger Report, a contributor at The Root and Post Everything, led a charter network, has been involved in higher education, and so sort of like can speak to this on the equity front, like on the ground, leading these networks of schools, especially in high need, racially diverse communities, how this stuff all plays out. So what we promised each of our guests is we'd give them 5 minutes if they wanted to take it, just to respond to the presentation and the reports themselves, and then we'll mix it up. So they don't have to take the 5 minutes, but you're welcome to it. So maybe we'll go first, Gail.
Sure, I probably won't take 5 minutes just to set the tone, but I will say that one of the startling things that jumped out for me in the data was the idea that around 1 in 4 charter schools have substantially fewer students of poverty than their neighboring traditional schools. And for me, that becomes a really critical piece to focus on as an authorizer. As an authorizer, what I'm looking for when a school says we're going to serve this community is, are they serving the community? And the community needs to, the school community needs to reflect the diversity of the surrounding community from my perspective as an authorizer. And that's for a couple of reasons, because when you think about that notion that charter schools might not have a reflection of poverty, what we know is that poverty has incredible, it can very intensely impact the level of instruction that's provided in a school. Students who come from poor backgrounds tend to have heard, I think the number's like 30 million fewer words by the time they start kindergarten. They're 12 to 14 months behind when they do start public school in terms of their ability to read or their literacy rates. And so all of those things put additional pressures on a school. So if a school is pulling students from a specific community and not pulling those students that have the greatest need, it becomes important to understand what that might do to those surrounding schools. But additionally, it becomes critically important when you think about the idea of choice, and you think about the fact that students have choice. A couple of things play into that. So one, do parents actually know that the school exists and can serve their children? And then do they feel welcome in that environment? So as an authorizer, I'm looking for those things as well. I'm looking for folks who are going to do those things that across the board are important for schools to do, right? They'll have strong leaders, they'll have excellent teachers, they'll have feedback systems that work appropriately so that they can continually improve. And then once I see that, what I'm looking for is, are they serving everyone? Because if they're not, then they put additional pressures on the rest of the system. When I think about charters and I think about their innovation, I know that what parents are looking for are excellent educations for their kids. That's sort of, they want a safe place, they want a place where folks will care about their children, and they want to know that their kids are getting a really good education that in many cases, and poverty in Atlanta is intergenerational. So what we're talking about is the fact that your grandparent may not have been able to read, your parent may not have been able to read, and now you're going into a school environment where parents are hoping that you will get that extra push. And so it becomes critically important when a school says we're going to open, that they're making that family feel comfortable and feel like they're welcome in that school community, and they're serving those families in the same way. And so as an authorizer, those are the kinds of issues that I'm focusing on and paying attention to, just ensuring that, and we have great charter schools in Atlanta. I wanna make that clear. We don't see a lot of the variation that showed up in some of this data, But I think that's one of the reasons why our charters are that strong, because they're making sure that their programs serve all kinds of students. And we have lots of specialized charters as well, and still don't see that kind of variation that showed up in the data that was here today. So for me, authorizing becomes a critical piece of this conversation, making sure that schools are serving everyone and doing that really well.
Can I press on one part of this? I don't have an answer on it, so I'm asking partially just devil's advocate and just straight curiosity, which is, I've been thinking about this in terms of like legitimate and illegitimate differences. Like, what are the differences where we would see and say, that's rational, that's fine, and the ones where we would say, ooh, something nasty went on there. So let me give you two examples. Imagine there is a charter school that we see has 25 percentage points fewer special education kids. An instinct would be, well, they're pushing out special education kids or canceling them out. It could be the case that the families in that area with special education students have recognized that the district has lots of money and lots of services and some great teachers, and so it's a choice-based system. They are deciding that the district is providing a better service for their kids. Imagine there's a charter school that is pronouncing every single day, college to and through for all of our kids, college to and through for all of our kids. But in the community, some of the low-income families are saying, I don't know about college debt. I don't know if it's worth it anymore. I really want a high school that doesn't prepare my kid for college as much as CTE, getting my student ready to go to a 2-year program and maybe get a certificate so he or she can enter the workforce immediately. So maybe in that case, the charter has fewer low-income kids because their families are looking for something that school is not promoting, that it's all about. In both of those cases, I could make the case that, wow, families are making rational, legitimate decisions based on the needs of their kids, and it's revealing itself as differences that we might be uncomfortable with. On whose side do we land, the authorizer or the family side?
So that is am I to respond?
Yeah, please.
So that is an interesting question. In the case of special education, I would say that our charter schools are required to accept students regardless of their special needs, and parents might well be making that choice. In the case of a sort of a college or career-focused kinds of school, a lot of that is around marketing, and a lot of that is around knowing your community. So as an authorizer, that's one of the things that I'm looking for. How well does this charter school know the community? How much community support do they have? So if you're entering into a community where the primary focus might be a CTAE curriculum, then are you able to provide that? Can you supplement your college-going career with your CTAE? Those are the kinds of conversations we're going to have when a school is even thinking about starting up, so that it doesn't run into that kind of situation where it has far fewer students of poverty. In Atlanta, that happens not to be an issue since we're about 75% free and reduced lunch anywhere you go. With the exception of some very few zip codes, you're going to find lots of students of poverty.
Great, thank you. Nina.
Great, thank you. I want to take a moment to thank the AEI and Nat for pulling this together. It took me a while to figure out those horizontal bar charts, but once you understand how they work, it was actually quite fascinating to see all this data in one place. I'm going to make 3 quick points, and hopefully I won't go above my 5-minute allocation. First and foremost, and this is something that your paper definitely points out, charter schools are schools of choice, which means that by design, they have to do something to attract families to their schools. So if they looked exactly like public schools, I don't think we would be actually doing what we were supposed to do, which is to come up with a set of boutique-like customized curriculum to attract certain student populations and really get people excited to make a switch from their traditional schools to a charter school. Let me give you one example. Right here in DC, you have the Yu Ying Charter School, which is a language immersion, Mandarin immersion school. The odds are that most of the families who are sending their kids to Yu Ying either have one family member who speaks Chinese, or they're really interested in making sure their children are getting immersed in Chinese. So I'm not surprised that Yu Ying is not attracting a lot of diversity, and that's, to me, a good thing. I think we have to be concerned, though, to the extent charters are gaining greater market share in places like New Orleans, DC, and other places. as you hit a certain percentage point, you then do need to be a little bit more concerned with whether you are serving the kind of the broad, plethora of the students in that community. And I think so. Otherwise, I think the fact that you have a few charter schools that are doing certain things differently and attracting students who are interested in that charter for a variety of reasons, that doesn't tell me anything. And I think it's fine that that we have variety and differences in different communities. The second point I want to make, I think your second paper highlights this, are kind of the huge variations in charter laws and the policy climate at the state level. But as Gail mentioned, there are also greater variances below the state level. So you highlighted Oregon, for instance. Oregon, by our estimation, is one of the poorest quality charter school laws in the nation. Only charter districts can authorize, and there's nothing against districts, but the districts are authorizing, and these are, in our estimation, not real charter schools. I don't know what to make of that, but at the end of the day, I don't know that I would necessarily put Oregon up there as an example of a state with a robust charter school market or read too much into what's happening in Oregon. Pennsylvania also has a lot of variation. So, but at the authorizer level, I do think this is where another paper or another discussion would be interesting, because authorizers are making a lot of decisions right here in DC. When BASIS, which is a high-performing network from Arizona, moved to DC, the authorizer made it very clear to BASIS to ensure that they're attracting a diverse student population. This school is housed next to the Shakespeare Theater in downtown DC, but their outreach program necessitates that they bring students from Wards 7 and 8. So the student population in the BASIS in DC looks very different from the student population you have in Arizona. So I think we just need to be cognizant of the influence that we have at the authorizer level. I also think the fact that you use a 30-mile radius is actually quite broad. I don't know how many families actually would travel 30 miles to send their children to another school. So I would actually narrow your pool, if you can, just to see if you'll see greater variations or resemblances between the charters and their neighboring schools. And then last but not least, and Nat knows this already, the data set used is not a very clean data set. It's based on 2011-2012 data collection by the Office of Civil Rights. That data set has come under some criticism. The charter participation numbers are not perfect. If you look at the most recent data set, which is the 2013-2014 data set, I would hope, based on a lot of work that has happened over the past 5 years, that the numbers probably look different for charter schools. And I say this for a number of reasons. So again, the data set is 5 years old. 5 years is a lifetime in the life cycle of the charter school movement. We make a lot of self-corrections whenever we notice something going wrong. So in the case of special education, when I first started at the National Alliance, one of the first things we did was to help launch the National Center for Special Education in charter schools, precisely to make sure that charter schools understood the rights that special needs students brought, that they were equipped with serving the needs of special needs students, and in those communities where you had a density of charter schools, that they had resources available to them to make sure they're placing these students in the best setting. So that is something that hopefully the most recent data set will address. ELL. This is something that the GAO discovered a few years ago when they started to look at whether charters were serving the needs of ELL students. They discovered that we just didn't have a lot of information and data. So that GAO report didn't offer a lot of information. So again, I think hopefully the next data sets will offer more information, and the next time we get together here, we can have a more robust discussion around these. But for us as a community, it's important to have this information, and to the extent we want to make some course corrections, now that we have this, we can make some decisions. The latest kind of flavor of the month seems to be diverse charter schools. If you want to have diverse by design charter schools, then there's going to have to be a discussion about whether you want to have a large portion of Title I students in that school, or whether you do need to figure out a way to balance it out so that you're attracting a more socioeconomically diverse student population to your school, if you think that that's the best way to close the achievement gaps.
Well, one thing that Nina brought up that I'd never thought to explain this way, so it's like an epiphany for me, is it seems that chartering and districts represent two very different ways of our public education system dealing with America's pluralism. On the one hand, you have a district-based system where all kids are assigned to school based on home address. The idea being, yes, we're different, but we're going to come together. We're going to be acculturated, assimilated, all in a community school based on neighborhood. A different way of doing that is a choice-based system. You recognize our differences by saying families get to choose, and that's going to lead to self-selection and different patterns of school demographics. What I had never thought about is that when a charter market share is 5%, what you might be having is kids who are self-selecting out of the district schools may be kids who are in the lowest performing schools. So really what we have is still the district system, but recognizing parental choice just in the sense of getting kids out of schools that are not working. When it goes up to 30, 40, 50, 80, 100% charter market share, then you start to get to this entirely different way of public education being delivered. Literally, every single school is populated by parental choice, and all these historical things about equity and communities being together can go away. And that's sort of like the New Orleans model essentially now, where it's virtually entirely choice-based. So Nina, you can respond to that, or maybe that's a segue to your comments.
Was there a question?
Well, I guess it's, do you have like a thought about this? Like, how comfortable are you with the idea of an entire city's system of schools being populated entirely 100% by parental choice as opposed to the residential-based assignments?
Well, just very quickly, I mean, I think it's a good idea personally, and I think that more than anything, just giving, I'm going to answer it a little bit differently, I think giving school principals the same freedoms that charter school leaders have is a good thing. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know why we keep talking about charters and district systems and whatnot. And after 25 years of chartering, I really do wonder why it is that more districts are not replicating some of these things in their traditional schools. And the replication, the very basic thing that we think you can replicate immediately is giving your school principal more autonomy around curricular decisions, around how long the school day ought to be, and hiring teachers and so forth. So yeah, I think a choice-based system can work well, and districts will benefit if they engage more actively in empowering their principals and bringing the charter sector to the table.
If you don't mind, I would just jump in and say that I think states are actually showing some variation in that as well. So we look at the state of Georgia that now is offering something called charter districts, which grants districts now the same sort of level of flexibility that individual charter schools once had, which means they can now offer that to their traditional school principals. And I think that is really important.
Yeah, but why is it not happening more?
That's a question for us as the public, I think, to address. You're right.
All right, let's get Dr. Perry in here. What do you think?
Oh, well, first I want to thank Nat for pulling this together. Great research. You did accomplish one of your major goals of proving why you have to not look at charters versus traditionals in the aggregate. It makes sense to narrow that down. I will say that after 25 years of chartering and doing research on charters, we still, unfortunately, have to say the results are mixed. And that's a bad thing. To get to your point, isn't variability a good thing? Well, we got into this knowing that there were real problems with suspension, serving LEP students, serving Latino students, serving Black students. I would like to see reductions in suspension and expulsions consistently throughout time. I would like to see special needs kids served. Because remember, charter schools didn't create a suspension expulsion boom, but if we were to use the innovations that we were afforded, that would be the target. That is where the need is. So yes, I want to see variability, but I also want to see specificity. I want to see a reduction. I don't want to see schools in different states doing different things around core areas. And with that, I will say this, that I got into chartering not because I was a K-12 diehard, but I really did get into it. One, out of the necessity of Hurricane Katrina. We needed people to serve families well when you had a district that was literally submerged underwater, submerged socially, submerged economically. You had to do something different. I worry now that the movement, the charter movement, has been overwhelmed by choice. And now we're saying we want choice. We want all these postern doors. We want all these escape hatches from a district school. But what I think your paper found is when you do have schools with a backbone, with a clear mission that is distinct from this sort of amorphous, we can do traditional schools better, and that's what I think a lot of the movement has become. We can do better. Well, that's just kind of empty. What we do need are schools that are different, because that's where, again, I go back to the need. Innovation has to address a need. And in states and in districts all across the country, they are just basically using charters to dismantle districts, which doesn't necessarily give you improved schools. And just very briefly around what happens when you scale up to a city level. Remember, there's never complete choice. There are private schools in our spaces. And so one of the dangers about choice, and it's always this counterbalance, you do want this system where you can believe that we're all in this together. There is this value of democracy that is hinged upon. Can we literally do what Martin Luther King Jr. asked us to do, is go walk hand in hand to school? That civics actually should correspond to understanding the politics of your community. And so when you go to school miles away, and it's literally in a different place, you're missing one of the fundamental purposes of an education, and that is to work your community, to understand your community. So, and I'm a somewhat of a controversial figure in the charter space, because I really just believe in what your findings show for me, is that charter schools are just an empty vessel that people can really use them to their own devices. So you have some great players and you have some bad ones. I just worry that now we're at a place where we should have recognized after 25 years, suspension and expulsion should be reduced, or you should not be authorized. You should serve special needs students differently, or you should get your charter revoked. That there should be some regulation around these critical areas, because we've had a century of traditional schools that shows what folks will do. And now we have 25 years of what charter school, and we're doing the same things. So use innovation in a way that makes sense for our families in the here and now.
Okay, so one question I'd like to open up to all of you is, to be a total cynic. I think there are some families who could look at this presentation and say, are you kidding me? For 100 years, we've had a district-based system that was producing highly segregated schools, where districts, there were 100% white kids in one school, and a couple miles away it was 100% African American, or we knew English language learners were going to one place. The district system created that thing. Now, chartering is actually giving me and my community some choices, so we're not assigned to those kinds of segregated schools. And here you are in this fancy location, kind of blaming us and this charter sector. The results may not be totally equitable, but finally, at long last, my family, my community has choice over where our kids are going to school. Isn't this just a response to a 100-year-old system that was already producing segregatory results, and now at least families are in charge? What do you guys think?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that I think yes, and right. So the argument doesn't stop there. It's about what do we do next, and if we're interested in changing that issue of equity, then we've got to put some guardrails on what we do, so that we're not necessarily saying this is completely free reign, but we're saying, and I take this as sort of an important mantle for authorizers, we're saying how do we monitor so that we don't have really high suspension rates? How do we monitor so we ensure that special education students are getting the services they need in charter schools? How do we monitor so that those lotteries actually reflect applicants from across the community and not just a small subset? And that's where I think that push comes, so that you're not, in the same way that we pushed on districts to say you've got to have greater equity, I think we also have to push on charter schools to say that as well.
Other thoughts?
I mean, I agree, and I also believe that if most families from upper income backgrounds move to affluent school districts or send their children to private schools, so to give those same options to low income families, to me, seems like the right thing to do. And I don't want to get too bogged down in how much we have to keep them in these schools to save the system.
Well, I have a different, I actually believe we've always had a choice system for high income people.
That's right.
And I don't care what kind of system you create. There will be people who will want to separate themselves. Now, I just have always said, for me, I believe that you should resource schools so that they can serve students well wherever they live. I've always tried to make an argument for neighborhood schools because I don't want this idea that you have to go to a white district, a wealthy district, to have a great education. Put the pressure on that neighborhood to have a great school, because I just don't have faith. And the evidence is clear on this for me, that wealthy folk are somehow going to want to work with, go to school with, low-income Black kids. And so for me, I think we keep stretching. Let's give to parents what low-income families have, what upper-income families have. And no, I want a school based on the needs of that neighborhood, not what I see in a wealthy district. And that idea of a school will be better if it is more diverse, more white, whatever, is corrupting a lot of this choice movement.
Andy, if I could just
Please.
comment on the equity part. There's this problem of whatever we measure is what we manage. And so when we think about equity, especially from the school district perspective that we've been habituated in, which is we should see similar kinds of students, distributions of special education and so forth. We should see these across, because there is no choice across these schools. So with no choice, with the government sort of slotting who goes where, we want to see equity in there. That is equity in placement, but not equity in choice. There is no choice there. Liberty is just not really valued. And we entrust the government to do these placements for us. Now, if you switch that liberty and you give people an equity in the liberty that they get, which is what Andre's getting at, then you have to loosen the constraints on equity in placement. So one of the good ways to look at this is to look at single-sex schools. There's just a few of them, which really burns me up. I got to find some more of them to study in the new data. But they're really slanted. African-American families love single-sex schools, and I do not know why. But the question becomes, should we remove the choice for those schools to make sure that they are more integrated from the perspective that we would hold given the district's equity lens, which is sort of an output lens? Mm-hmm. And I would say that would be a mistake to insist that we would have sort of a racial homogenization as an output of equal equity, and that equity being in choice, right? So when you say the random, the lottery system should be representative of of all the students and all the applicants and so forth. I think that there's a real importance for us to make sure that those processes are truly equitable, that there's no dog whistles going on, that there's no, we have a school for wealthy kids, and don't worry about it, just sign on up. I think those are the problems that we need to focus. Those are very hard to focus on, and they're incredibly difficult to measure. So it's going to have to be someone that uses different tools than I've used here to try and measure that equity in inputs and processes.
Okay, if you don't mind, what I want to do is try to make this a bit more fluid now. So I'm going to ask one more question, and to the extent all of you guys want to weigh in on the different angles, you can. I'm going to start checking my phone, not because I'm rude, but I want to see if anyone watching elsewhere has questions. I promise I would look on my phone for that. And if any of you start to have burning questions, we have 25 minutes left. You don't have to ask them immediately, but if you do have a burning one, raise your hand. We can start to open this up to you. All right, we do have some burning questions. Okay, we'll get there in a second. So let me ask this, since we're supposed to be talking about research and policy. There are a couple different ways to start to solve, to the extent we may define the problems differently here, different levers of it. So one is, imagine Secretary DeVos gets confirmed today, and she reads this report and says, I would like to solve that. What can the federal government do to help? Or maybe the National Association of Charter School Authorizers says, yes, this is great data, what can authorizers do? Or maybe school founders say, I didn't realize that was happening. When I start my next school, I should do something. So whatever lens you want to bring to this, state policy, authorizer, national policy, school founder, how would you advise people to start to get at some of the things that we saw? Dr. Perry, want to start?
Oh, well, I've said that the charter movement, it's moved through phases. One, and where there was a little regulation, a lot of experimentation. And now we're in a phase where I think there's ample evidence to support that when you have a good support of regulation, that those schools can improve academically, socially, around issues of equity. And so for DeVos, I want her to, if she's nominated, which it looks confirmed, which it looks like she will be, to get rid of this free market approach. We've been there. It doesn't work. It creates this wide variability between states and districts. And I worked in Michigan, and I know there's a lot of hoopla about what happened in Michigan. But what I can say about Michigan that is definite, it was not predictable what you would get. And I just don't think you take those kind of risks with children. So I would advise to find those regulations that have been proven to allow schools to have the freedoms to do what they need to do, but they're not so confining that you are limiting the kind of innovations we need to address some of the needs that I mentioned earlier.
I would find a way to get Andre to join back the charter school movement. I don't know, based on when we can have a sidebar conversation afterwards. But honestly, I wouldn't do too much at the federal level. I don't think she has control over a lot at the federal level. She can certainly use her bully pulpit to talk about certain things that are working and things that are not working. She can advocate for more funding to support the replication and expansion of high-performing networks and schools. But beyond that, I don't think she has a lot of powers from a regulatory standpoint to do some of the things that people fear she might do. But at the end of the day, how well she will use the powers of the Office of Civil Rights to connect the choice movement to the civil rights movement will be important. And I don't know how much they've thought about using and leveraging OCR and this data collection tool to actually make the case for more choices rather than to...
Do you want to say a bit more about that? Just explain how that might actually work, if they wanted to be bold on OCR on this front.
Well, I mean, what they've said so far is that they will curb the powers of OCR or move it to the Department of Justice. I hope that they keep it at the U.S. Department of Education and that they clean up the data collection, maybe reduce the size of those questionnaires, encourage more schools to participate. I think if you're pushing an equity agenda and a choice agenda, you can definitely use these types of questionnaires to help make the case for more choices rather than to hide the data. Data traditionally has helped us make the case for more options.
Yeah.
So I would agree with what's been said and just say that a lot of the a lot of the pressure, I think, is also on authorizers to be sure that they are looking at those key elements and key components and being thoughtful, and also thinking of ourselves as partners with charter schools, so that we're not just oversight, but we're also supporting schools and getting closer to equity where we see there might be equity issues.
Nat, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I have a concern here that it certainly doesn't fall in the federal bucket, probably the state. It falls sort of in between the districts and authorizers, and that depends on what the palette of authorizers look like. Anyway, my real concern is that we have these sort of market theories, which I think can work, and I think they work better in some places than others. But I think we don't know who's actually participating in the market. I don't know who the kids are that don't even try to get into charters. And I think that we should assume that there are some kids who have lower social capital and their families have lower social capital that are willing to engage in that system. And my worry is that there is no place in this sort of network of authorities to figure out how to engage those non-participants. And I think that that's really important, right? So it may be, so this is where I go with a lot of the Hispanic low participation. Why is it that we have this sort of leaning across all charter schools? I mean, is it something about charter schools that universally are unappealing to Hispanics? Is that purposeful? That doesn't make sense to me. I wonder if there's something about the Hispanic community that keeps them from engaging in the market, applying to charter schools. And if that's the case, I think something needs to address that. And I don't know which crew that we just talked about would be responsible to engage those people.
I want to address that specific issue because I forgot to talk about it in my opening. Another mistake, I think, around marketing for charter schools in the early goings was this idea that we're going to help Black communities. And you really saw that in terms of who the ethos of the early charter movement. It was squarely focused on Black communities. In addition, the infrastructure for that was more robust. So you had BAYO and you had other organizations that supported that. And then compounding matters, you did not develop an expertise around LEP students, around special needs. And so districts really did have
Great point.
better supports. So, and this is where, and I say this, and I really do mean it, the charter movement really does have to lose its deficit perspective of Black children. Because while folks are well-meaning, it is also limiting their exposure to learn about other groups who need a quality education. This was not about saving Black children. It was about developing a different model. And we need to keep focusing on the innovation, not on the salvation of poor little Black kids, so to speak. And that's where I think where the charter sector will really develop products that are really different, not just the same old repackaged school. So
can I say, because this is a perfect segue to a comment that keeps coming up online, which is some people are viewing the data as being helpful, but the response is, well, families can only choose the schools that are available to them. How do we know that the schools that are available reflect what families actually want? And so a couple of different folks are pointing out, well, authorizers can only approve the applications that come before them. And families can only choose the ones that got approved. So what are we doing to make sure that the charter authorization process reflects sort of on the front end community demand for certain types of schools? And then what are we doing to make sure that we incubate or support different types of models so they can do applications, so they can apply to authorizers, so they can get out there? I mean, I guess the overarching point here is what we have in terms of the market of charter schools wasn't written in the stars. It just happened to be that way because of policy and practice. Do we need to do something differently on the supply of schools so these results can change? Any thoughts, Nina, you wanted to get in?
But can I just answer this last question
Yeah.
about Hispanic participation? It kind of surprised me actually to see that, because some of the best schools that I've seen are schools that are serving the needs of ELL students. So Camino Nuevo, public charter schools in California, IDEA public charters in Texas. So to the extent charters have gone into those communities to serve the needs of LEP students, I do think they are knocking it out of the park. But there is also this notion of, to the extent you're an immigrant, you tend not to question authority too much. So from an outreach standpoint, I do think charters do need to do a better job of explaining and making people understand that making a choice is okay. And it's a different type of outreach that needs to be embedded in the way they want to reach these communities. As to your other question, I don't know. I mean, I look at DC again. Scott Pearson, who runs the DC Public Charter School Board, goes to conferences to see who are some of the highest performing charter operators out there who want to come open schools in DC. He's constantly trying to attract innovators and individuals to come and take a look at the application here. You can open up to 20 charter schools in DC every year. So I do think it takes a wise authorizer who's looking at this as a mechanism to really attract the best of the best and also meet the needs of the specific communities in the city. So last year, for instance, he opened a specific school to meet the needs of homeless students. Most of the schools that they have opened in recent years have been targeted at serving these specific niches like special needs and whatnot. So that, again, I put it back on authorizers.
No, and I think that in some ways is where it belongs. It's appropriate that we are actually requiring that folks who are developing charter petitions, who are interested in opening up charter schools, are also going out and asking the community, what is it that you want? So in addition to us looking and reaching out and seeing who might serve a need, if you're going to embed in a community, you need to have a conversation with that community as well, so that you're ensuring that your school is meeting the needs.
Great. Please go ahead and respond. If you have a question, please raise your hand and the mics will find you.
I think let's go to the questions.
Okay. Grant's behind you. Again, please just introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Good morning. My name is Shauna Comer. I'm an Albert Einstein Fellow at the Department of Energy and a proud product of New York City public school system, and as well as spending 9 years in the classroom as a public school educator. My question is around the concept of charter schools and their intent originally as innovators to provide information that will then enhance district schools. And I don't see that happening. And I'm wondering why the successful innovations that are happening in these charter schools are not being transferred into the district schools, so that's creating this sort of dichotomy of public schools are bad, charter schools are good, and this is a perception that people have and why people are flocking and competing and fighting to get their children into charter schools, and why then are these district schools not improving? Why are we not seeing those improvements so that there isn't this competition either or? This sense of lack if you're in a traditional public school.
So let me, if you don't mind, I want to answer like the first part of that question with some empirical data, because I had heard this so much about a decade ago, which is the purpose of chartering is to experiment on a small scale and then share secrets, best practices with the real system, the district system. So I actually went back to the preambles of all of the nation's state charter laws to actually ask, okay, what did the state legislators who were creating charter laws have in mind? In some cases, it was that exact thing. Incubate small ideas shared with the real system. But there were also 17 other reasons that charter laws were created according to the state legislatures: empowering low-income families, giving teachers a wide array of options in which they can teach, experimenting and then replicating successful practices that never emerged in the district system. So all of those could be legitimate, are legitimate, but I think that sort of like gets to this. What are we actually trying to get at here with chartering in general? So I don't want to like sort of co-opt the question, but I want you to have the opportunity to say, well, I disagree with the premise that all we're doing is small scale experimentation to then share with someone else.
I would say two things. I think it takes two to tango. So to the extent you are innovating and the district is kind of ignoring you, and this happens quite a bit, it's hard to start that dialogue. The second thing is actually you do need to invest a lot more in research and evaluation to make sure that whatever innovation is taking place is in fact scalable. I don't think we're making enough investments in that area to really confidently say that this is something you can take to scale and this is how you do it. But in those places like Denver, where you have charters and district schools cohabiting, And everyone highlights Denver as a good example. You have the business community, you have the mayor, you have the superintendent, you have the charter community kind of coming together. And over time, regardless of what's happened, these individuals have kind of banded together and stayed together and are treating charter schools as part of the public education fabric. And I would argue that Tom Boasberg and others need to take that motto and talk to other districts about it, because that kind of peer-to-peer learning is ultimately what will get other school districts to follow suit.
I would just add that I think there are a number of districts that are looking towards that, looking towards partnering with their charter schools to understand those schools that are high performing, what are you doing and how are you doing it? I mentioned before that Georgia is providing more flexibility for districts. I think that goes a long way when you sort of untie the hands of districts and say, you can use the same flexibility as charter schools. Then what you can do is start to push down autonomy at the traditional school level, and principals then begin to have the possibility of trying that innovation that at their neighboring charter school works really well, and seeing how they can incorporate that in their more traditional environment. And the other thing that we've done in Atlanta is we've actually hired some of our high-performing charter operators to run our lowest performing schools. And we just started that this year because what we recognized was they are serving the profile of students in Atlanta. They have our kids, they know them, and they're doing an incredible job. Why not offer that to a more traditional environment? So they still have standard enrollment zones that they're required to work with, but they're able to bring their full program. So we're going to take a very close look and see how successful that is for us as well.
Democrats who are for education reform, not deeper, but Democrats have an interesting dilemma. Many Democrats have been seduced into really adopting a Republican view of the role of government. And with that, they've sort of just assumed that unions are bad and that districts are bad. When I've always said, chartering it's a nebulous term. I mean, you can do what you want with it. But we've sort of taken on these fights that make no sense in a lot of districts, particularly in rural communities. You're like, okay, look, we need unions and districts and charters to actually work together. You can't go, quote, using the popular term nuclear in a rural district. Right. And so you need people to work together, but we've adopted these very aggressive philosophies against school districts that I don't know if they make any sense. And so for me, it's about, at least on the Democrat side, because I'm never going to convince sort of free market folks that a district is a great thing for the most part. I'm generalizing. But I can convince Dems that, we don't have to get in this fight. We can actually compel district leaders to look more charter-like. They have the ability to do that. But literally, now it's so toxic an environment that teachers hear charter, and it's like, it's the devil. It's like, come on now, this is not true. And districts need to change. Yeah. If we're doing anything, if I took my wife to the same restaurant for the last 10 years, at some point she's gonna say, you know what, you need to change it up a bit. Yeah. Same thing. I mean, at some point you change with needs. And so the word charter has too much baggage, but we need to find a way to decentralize, and that's jargony too, but to make school districts smaller, because this idea that 7 people can run hundreds of schools is a bad idea. But we do need to learn how can principals actually develop a great school in a neighborhood for those families. And it works through charter. That's why I went into it. Because that idea, actually, that's a very convenient model to apply. But when I was, and this is where it gets personal, when you're asked to take on enemies that you just don't believe in, that's when it falls apart for me.
We have time for one more question.
Well, Andy, I just wanted to jump in quickly on the two things in your question. First of all, I think it's important to just bring the empirical evidence to that discussion that you're talking about, that charters are not necessarily better. And people should know that, because if they just believe, oh, well, it's charter and it's better, then they're going to make bad decisions about where to send their kids on a flawed assumption. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that it's not just a cooperative way that districts can improve with charters. So there's some sense of the sort of competitive advantages, which I have particular ideas about. But I do remember Kaya Henderson, the former DC chief, saying, I think it was at our old building, she said, I am so tired of hearing that charters are eating my lunch, and I want to be able to do what they can do. And if you look at DC, you see that they do have more flexibility than they used to, and I do not think, I believe this firmly, that they would have that flexibility if there was not a charter sector counterpoint driving them to say, hey, let's give educators the authority to run schools. So I do think that is happening, and it's not only happening through cooperation.
We have time for one more question. Does anyone have one? Up front. One thing I'll say is I'm such a fan of charter authorizing, having done it before, and admire the work that Gail does. If any of you ever think about working for a charter authorizer, like these questions we're dealing with here are not philosophical. Like a charter authorizer, if like a city has 20% charters and they're doing quite well, and they could approve 5 more charters, the district could say, if you approve those, you're gonna hurt my budget, you might hurt my kids. The authorizer has to decide, well, you probably haven't improved enough, even though we have 20% kids in charters. Do we put the additional pressure on you by starting these new programs that families want, or do we hold back and not approve anymore so these ideas can seep their way into the district? If you think there's an obvious answer to that question, you and I are on different sides. Like, I think that's a legitimate, very tough question, and lots of cities and authorizers have to deal with this on an annual basis. It's a challenge. Please.
Yeah. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. My question is, do you have a data analysis for the existing information, let's say the public schools, their program, their budget, and how good are their administrative staff, and what's wrong with the public school, and especially when they have a magnet school or a program, they have after-school program, they have a special need programs. So exactly why this program cannot be improved, what a problem cannot be solved, why you have to create, that is not really necessarily what you call innovative. Because in public school, you can have the good teachers, the teacher themselves can improve themselves skill and knowledge or high tech. What's the matter that you cannot improve the public school, that you have to create a new terminology, what's so-called charter school, then nobody, no parents understand just what's going on?
Great question. So we're running up on time, so how about this? I'd like each of the panelists respond to the extent that you would like, and then use this as your chance to sort of final comments, thoughts on the event, and we'll just go down the line. So Nat, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to say why we can't improve public schools. I think there's a faulty premise there. I think public schools across the nation do a fantastic job. They have a tall order. Take all comers, educate them to high standards. If you can do a better job, get in the game. It's tough. I think that we need to, I hope this data is helpful to understand sort of the variety that we see in charter schools. And I'm going to keep looking at it and updating it, as Nina has encouraged me to do with the most recent data, to keep an eye on where and when charters are working. I think the greatest thing about charter schools and what differentiates them more than anything from traditional public schools is there's some planned obsolescence there. We can shut them down when they don't work. And if we don't do that, then the charter theory doesn't work. So, I am a friend of charter schools and also the first guy to advocate for shutting down ones that don't work.
Thank you. Gail?
So I think that that's a really tough question. I do think that traditional districts work really hard to improve their neighborhood schools. That's their primary function. I think one of the things that will help us do that is really a relaxing of all the regulations on districts. And now that we're starting to experience that, we're able to do some of the things that are much more flexible that charter schools have been able to do. But historically, that wasn't available to us. So I think we'll see using that flexibility improves traditional school performance if it's done well.
You know, charter schools are public schools, and I wish we could kind of move away from constantly talking about charter public. I think if I have one wish for this movement is for us to do a better job of defining this as something that is there to serve the needs of the public, and it just so happens it's charter versus public versus magnet and whatnot. And I would also say that at the end of the day, it's extremely important for us to take a look at the data that Nat and others have put together and make these adjustments depending on the state that you're in, the needs of the community. At the end of the day, though, for me and for a lot of individuals, this was a way to bring community back into the public school enterprise. And in a lot of school districts, community leaders are running very effective charter schools, and we just kind of need to go back to that premise more and away from kind of the institutional nature that some of these districts, unfortunately, have taken on as they've grown in size.
You know, I used to always say the point of school reform is not to improve a school, it's to improve a community. That at the end of the day, you're not going to fire your way to educational or community success. You're not going to expel or suspend your way to educational or community success. That we also have to stop this idea, inflating what schools can do without community support. And so for me, I've always said, hey, this is about community development and how do we leverage schools to make schools whole. I don't see wealthy, safe neighborhoods with bad schools in them. I just don't see them. And so for me, it's always been about how, and I live in New Orleans, how can we make a criminal justice system work? How can we make economic development plan work for low-income families? How can we make healthcare accessible, affordable, and effective? It's the same question that I asked for schools. But for some reason, I see a lot of reform being done in education. I don't see the same emphasis on these other areas, and I might get killed for saying this, but I do see limitations on what we're doing in schools when the world around them, our families, are crumbling. And so for me, it's like, okay, I want to improve schools, but don't get it twisted. If folks are getting shot, if they don't have jobs, you know, it's not a waste of resource, but we're missing the point of why we go to school.
Thank you. We are right at time, so please join me in thanking Nat for his research and our panelists for a terrific conversation. You can find the video up on our website later on today. Thank you for joining us. Hope we see you again sometime. Thanks.